The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those who invited were not worthy. Go, therefore, into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so that the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man was there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. It's been a difficult week because of an act of terror by an extremist group, because of the resulting humanitarian crisis, and because of the way the present conflict has given rise to a renewed hostility and divisiveness, feeding into an unhelpful binary that would have us take sides. As skyscrapers and government buildings light up in blue and white, and politicians adorn their lapels with Star of David flags and well-meaning public support for Israel, the ripple effects have only fueled a heightened divisiveness. What about Palestine? What about the innocent civilians in Gaza whose water, electricity, and basic services and supplies have been cut off, whose homes and businesses have been destroyed, who mourn for dead loved ones, both Muslims and Jews, and Christians too, and everyone in between? Amid increasing violence and hostility, we're led to believe that we're only allowed to be either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, and that we can't possibly be both. If we look to our gospel text in the midst of this current global climate, our attention might be drawn immediately to the center of the action, the senseless and gratuitous violence, all resulting from a rejected invitation of would-be wedding guests who seize the king's slaves, mistreat them, and kill them, and an enraged king who responds in turn by sending his troops to destroy those responsible and burn their city to the ground. Violence begets violence. There's no good news in that. At the onset of this parable, like so many of Jesus' parables, is a comparison. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to, translation, this is what God's way of life is all about, so listen up. And what it's about at the onset is an extravagant wedding banquet to which all are invited. But the original invited guests have other plans, tending to their farm, managing their business, better things to do. So the invitation is made even wider. Invite everyone you can find, both good and bad. The guests are corralled in from the street with no notice, and as one commentary suggests, so the king's attendants must have given them all wedding robes at the door. And then what? One man is spotted without a wedding robe? The king's reaction might strike us as excessive and harsh, but this is clearly not a parable meant to be taken literally or as a realistic morality tale. And to be clear, the outer darkness, despite what some interpretations have suggested, is not some kind of eternal divine punishment. That's not what this is about. At its core, this is a parable about rejection. The original guests reject the king's invitation because they have better things to do. As for the guest who refuses to wear a wedding robe, well, he too lets his own prideful self-importance get in the way, whatever the reason. The invitation is wide open. There isn't a single thing to get in the way. The trouble comes when the guests assert and prioritize their own agenda, when their own beliefs and inflated self-importance get in the way. Oh, you're having a party? Well, I have a better idea. This is not a parable meant to be taken literally, but it is meant to be taken seriously. This parable shows us what it looks like when we reject the invitation to God's way of life and the abundant life to which God freely calls us. This parable comes after a long history of human rejection of divine promise in our scriptures, history that continues to our present day. Even if it's just implicitly, we have this tendency to push back against the invitation. We assert our own agendas. We try to take charge and do things our way. Meanwhile, God keeps inviting both good and bad and expanding the invitation. Meanwhile, we keep rejecting, asserting our own agendas over the commonwealth of the kingdom of heaven and seeking to set limits on God's invitation. It's hardly a coincidence, I think, that this parable immediately follows Jesus' entry into Jerusalem just one chapter before, setting into motion the events of Holy Week, a week which would inevitably end with his death. Over and over throughout his ministry and teaching up to this moment, Jesus has been extending the invitation to the kingdom of heaven and God's extravagant and abundant love. Yet ultimately on the cross, in the words of one hymn writer, God's blood upon the spearhead, God's love refused again. Here's the good news. Despite everything, God's love is still for all. Now that might sound overly simplistic, but it bears repeating. God's love is for all. There is literally no downside to being loved like that. There is no reason to reject the invitation. God's love isn't going to run out. Try as we might, we can't set limits on what is, by its very nature, limitless. When we set aside our own agendas and instead center God's limitless love, when we really start to understand what that means, or as much as we can anyway, it's simply no longer possible to fall into a binary trap of this versus that, Israel versus Palestine, us versus them. God invites us all to an extravagant feast and lovingly sets a place for each one of us to dine together. To be perfectly clear, this is not to suggest that we ought to overlook acts of evil and just join in one big chorus of kumbaya. living into the kingdom of heaven as Jesus preached it, of God's commonwealth of justice and peace, necessitates speaking out against terror and violence, and against a bitter, resentful divisiveness that would have us take sides. The truth is that God's people are hurting. And instead of being forced to take sides, God's love compels us to draw near to those who suffer, Jewish and Muslim, and everyone in between. God's love compels us to lament the death of innocent Palestinians and the death of innocent Israelis. God's love ultimately compels us to side with justice, to condemn both the attack by Hamas and the Israeli occupation. Well, one narrative would have us take sides in an unhelpful binary, as binaries tend to be. God's narrative compels us to embrace all who are hurting, which is ultimately a narrative with zero room for anti-Semitism, with zero room for Islamophobia, with zero room for hatred of any kind. God's love draws us all again and again back to the banquet table, both good and bad, worthy and unworthy. At God's banquet table, there is a place for all, calling us to a love that refuses to be party to violence and resentful divisiveness, a love that cannot be overcome by our own agendas. God's love is simply too powerful, and the invitation is relentlessly persistent. Come to the table. Take your place. At this table, God feeds us with hunger for justice and thirst for peace.